Good day. Today we're going to look at graphing the sine curve with the a, b, and c coefficients. First thing to look for is the coefficients. A here is this number in front, which is going to be 2. The b is the number in front of the x, which is going to be, in this case, 4. And the c term, be careful now, it's plus c, so the rc term here is negative pi over 4. So these are our most important coefficients. The next thing we need to look for is the new period. The new period is the old period, which is 2 pi divided by the b. Our b is 4. So my new period would be 2 pi over 4, which breaks down into pi over 2. It's always good to write in lowest terms. We're going to do a method called quarter periods. So the quarter period is going to be our new period, and we're just going to divide it by 4. Now that's the same as saying pi over 2 times 1 over 4, and you get pi over 8. So the last thing we have to do is, before we start graphing, is our displacement. Our displacement is minus c over the b. Remember, our c was actually a negative pi over 4. We'll have a little glance at it again here. That was our c. It came from right here. And my b term was 4. This becomes pi over 16. This here is my starting position. So what we have to do now is to draw a table. So let's go up a little bit further here. You make a simple x and y table. Here's x, and here's my y. If we do this out properly, and we have this done correctly, I should say, we'll generate 5 points, and we'll go around from 0, 90, 180, 270, back to 360. The starting point was pi over 6. Sorry, pi over 16. Where does pi over 16 go into? It goes into the original equation right here for the x. If you put pi over 16 into the x, you're going to get pi over 4 minus pi over 4. That is 0. The sine of 0 is 0. So now my first y point is going to be 0. Now, how do we find our next point? It's going to scroll over a little bit more. Our next point is, you take your point you had a minute ago, which is pi over 16, and we add that quarter period to it. Now our quarter period was pi over 8. So we're going to add pi over 8. We work this out, and it's going to give you 3 pi over 16. If you put this number here back into this x right here, so you're going to say 4 times 3 pi over 16, subtract pi over 4, that gives you an answer of pi over 2. Sine of pi over 2, or sine of 90 degrees, is 1. So we're going to say 2 times 1, so my next y value would be 2. How do we find our next set of points? We take our last point, 3 pi over 16. We add the quarter period to it again, and this gives me 5 pi over 16. Again, you take the 5 pi over 16 and you place it right back into here where the x is. So we're going to say 4 times 5 pi over 16, which is 20 pi over 16, minus pi over 4. That gives me an answer of just pi. So pi is 180 degrees. Sine of 180 degrees is 0, so this next point is going to be 0. How do we find our next point? Because we want to find 5 points. We take our 5 pi over 16, add our quarter period, And this would give me 7 pi over 16. Again, we take the 7 pi over 16, place it into the x right here. So 4 times 7 pi over 16 would be 28 pi over 16. Subtract pi over 4, and this breaks into a thing called 3 pi over 2, which in radian terms to degrees terms is 270 degrees. So now we want to find sine of 270 degrees. Well, sine of 270 degrees is -1. Times it by 2, and you get an answer of -2. That's our fourth point, so we want to get our fifth point. We take 7 pi over 16, add the pi over 8 again, and it would give me 9 pi over 8. We take the 9 pi over 8 we found here, replace it again with the x into here, so 4 times 9 pi over 8, so that's going to be 36 pi over 8 minus pi over 4. That breaks down to 2 pi, which is 360 degrees. Sine of 360 degrees is 0. 2 times 0 is 0. So now we have our points. So what we do now is we make our graph. To make our graph, we literally just draw a straight line across, and we have our x-axis. I mean our y-axis here, this is our x-axis. My starting point was right here. That number there was pi over 16. We make equal spaces. We put another point there, 3 pi over 16. Another space here equally done, which is 5 pi over 16. Then we have another one here, which is 7 pi over 16. And finally, the end here would be 9 pi over 8. All these values on the x-axis came from my table here in the x-axis table. If you look closely, my range goes from -2 to 2 in my y-axis. So all we have to do is place the number 2 here, make the equal distance up here, and we call this point 2. So we know from our graph, pi over 16, the y value was 0. At 3 pi over 16, my y value was 2. At 5 pi over 16, my y value was 0. At 7 pi over 16, my y value was -2. At 9 pi over 8, my y value was 0. So we literally just take our pen and we make one period of our sine curve. And that's how you draw the graph of y equals 2 sine 4x minus pi over 4.